Bob Costas, welcome back to Meet the Press.
And welcome back to NBC. Feels like I never left.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here and to be sitting with you. The NBA season is winding down. We're in the middle of baseball season. The NFL is right around the corner, so it seemed like the perfect time to sit and have a conversation with you.
Okay.
You, of course, retired from play-by-play announcing last year. What has this chapter of your life been like?
You know, I really think that for a number of years, I was rightly in an emeritus stage. It was only by a fluke that I came back and called a few postseason series on TBS, and I wasn't quite as good at it, to be honest, as I had been for 40 years. And when you care about your craft and you care about that particular sport, baseball, as much as I do, I just didn't want to hit beneath my lifetime batting average. I could have continued, but it was my decision not to. But I think that all the other things, the interviews, the commentaries, the essays, all the other things that I did previously, I can still do, but at an emeritus position, not the front and center guy anymore.
You wanted to move into this next chapter on a high note, in other words.
Yes, I did. I did. Everything at NBC for nearly 40 years was pretty fulfilling. And we did a lot of good work together. My thanks to all the producers and all the people that I worked with, both on the air and off. But collectively, we did a lot of good work. So that ended or included the sort of things that I hoped for. And I didn't feel that this last chapter in baseball quite aligned with the standard of my career. And nobody wants the last note of a symphony to be discordant, you know, or if you're a basketball player, you never leave the gym on a miss, you leave on a make. So you feel good. You know, in fact, I was thinking about stepping away from the Olympics. I wound up doing 12 of them. And on my 11th, I was thinking maybe this is enough. But then I got pink eye in Sochi, which was quite a cause celeb and memes everywhere, and you had to be good-natured about it. But you can't leave on the pink eye Olympics, so I had to come back and do one more in Rio.
So you did 12 Olympics because of that pink eye episode, which I can only imagine must have been one of the more challenging of your entire career.
Pink eye was the 11th. I woke up the morning of the first telecast, look in the mirror, and my left eye was like a slit. And I'm thinking, what is this? I didn't feel bad. And the doctors told me, well, it's just some sort of little infection. Here's the antibiotics. It'll be done with in 3 days, which is why I said, okay, I can host for 3 days and it'll be gone. And then we realized when it jumped to the other eye that it was viral and it doesn't go away that quickly. It was full-blown viral conjunctivitis. And some people said, because people just say anything now, there's no barrier of credibility, accountability, honesty, fairness. There's no barrier to commenting anywhere on the internet. So it was like, oh, he couldn't bear to give up his seat. No, I was the only one who had prepared to do that particular job. Everyone else had prepared to be at various venues. And so eventually they had to bring in Matt Lauer and Meredith Vieira from the Today Show, and the researchers wrote the copy for them, and of course they're good professional broadcasters, and they were able to take care of it. But the reason why I stayed until I couldn't see anymore was because I felt it was my obligation to NBC and to all the people who had worked for all that time, 2 years or more, gathering information, preparing features. I'm the one carrying the ball for them. That's why I did it.
Well, it was one moment in just an extraordinary career. I'm going to name a few of the incredible moments of your career. More than 40 years, hosting almost a dozen Olympics, or a dozen Olympics, as you say, countless World Series, NBA championships, Super Bowls. You are also the only person in television history to win an Emmy in sports, news, and entertainment. What does it feel like when you hear that canon, your body of work?
Well, mostly I think about how fulfilling it was to do something I dreamed of doing as a kid, the sports part, and then to find out Dick Ebersol had to convince me, ran NBC Sports for a long time, started Saturday Night Live along with Lorne Michaels. He had to convince me that I could do a non-sports show. And later with Bob Costas, which followed David Letterman and later Conan O'Brien on NBC, is one of the most fulfilling chapters of my life, really. And it has a new life now on YouTube. And I keep hearing from people, oh, I saw you last night with so-and-so. And that, when I first heard it, I think it was Dennis Hopper that the person mentioned. And I said, what was this, a seance? Dennis Hopper's been gone. No, it's on YouTube. So it's gratifying to hear that. And I guess if there is anything that might have distinguished me to some small extent, it's that I checked a lot of boxes. I did a lot of different things, and I hope I did them well.
Yeah, well, let's talk about how your career started and the breadth of your work. I mean, you have shared that in your senior year of high school, you were actually cut from both the baseball and the basketball teams, and that experience actually reinforced something that was already inside of you, which was this desire to become a sports broadcaster. Was that in your gut always?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it shouldn't be framed as, oh, he wanted to be a ball player, and then when he found out he couldn't and they cut him, then he decided to be a broadcaster. I was smart enough when I was 10 years old to realize if I was ever going to get into Yankee Stadium without buying a ticket, it was going to be in the booth, not to be wearing pinstripes out there on the field. But, you know, you're in high school, and I wasn't half bad. I was good enough to be the last guy cut, but I knew I wasn't going to be the star of the team. And it was just amusing that the baseball coach actually said to me when he cut me, he said something to the effect of, you're not bad with the glove and you can run a little bit, but I don't think you can hit your weight, and I don't think you weigh 130, which might have been true when I was 16 years old. And then he said, have you ever thought about broadcasting? And I said, that's pretty much all I think about. And he was a wry guy, and he said, good, try that. So he was onto something. He was a good scout, both of baseball talent, lacking, and maybe potential broadcast talent. Not too bad.
You took his advice.
I did.
Yeah, well, I know that in addition to that, you write about the fact, and you've talked about the fact that your father also had a really big impact on your life. He tragically passed away of a heart attack when you were just 18 years old. How did that impact who you are, the person you became, the icon that you became?
Well, my father was an inveterate gambler, and I looked at him as a sort of Runyon-esque character, colorful, humorous, high-spirited, but it would be untruthful to say that it was all smooth sailing. There was a lot of trauma in our family life because he had a volatile temper, and the mortgage was often riding on how his bets went, and he didn't bet on, you know, cards or poker games or crap games or go to the racetrack. He bet on baseball, football, basketball games. And so I bonded with him by following those games. I'm sure I would have been a sports fan anyway, like most of my fans, but I became even more knowledgeable. I became granularly knowledgeable because he was following all of this so closely, and I was by his side. Now, when you lose someone close to you when you're so young, and your own sense of yourself is not fully formed, you'll always wonder, I wonder to this day, how he would have reacted to my good fortune. Could I have made him part of my life in the way I made my children and my friends part of that life? I'd like to think so, but I can't know for sure.
Well, I know that you have written about him, and as you say, there were some complicated parts, but obviously a lot that inspired you as well. You did get your first job at NBC when you were in your 20s, 1980. You say you looked like you were 15 years old. Talk about the fact that you had butterflies, but you say you weren't exactly overwhelmed. Can you take me back to that very first moment that Bob Costas was on air? What did it feel like?
Well, the first time I was on air was radio in Syracuse, where I went to college, and then radio in St. Louis. And I wound up on CBS TV when I was just 24 doing regional games. But my first full-fledged job in network television was in 1980 when I came to NBC. And when I did my first broadcast, I was not yet 28 years old, and I looked about half that. And the late, great Don Ohlmeyer, who ran NBC Sports and who had hired me, called me into his office and said, you know, you have a lot of potential. We really like you. How old are you? And I said, I'll be 28 in March. He said, damn it, you look like you're 14. And he actually said the following, how much older do you think you would look if you grew a beard? And I said, oh, 5 years at least. And he perked up. He said, 5 years, really? I said, yeah, because that's how long it would take to grow it. so that idea didn't pan out. But I guess to your question, I had butterflies. But I'd done well enough on the radio and also in my handful of opportunities with CBS TV, I'd done well enough to not feel overwhelmed. Was I as good as Dick Enberg or Al Michaels or anyone at that level then? No. But I was good enough for Don Ohlmeyer and other people to believe that I could become someone at that level.
How do you go from being a 28-year-old with butterflies to one of the greatest sports broadcasters in history?
You know, as with a lot of things, it's circumstantial to some extent. Had Bryant Gumbel not left sports to go to the Today Show, then probably I would have remained as just a play-by-play guy. When I say just, there are many great play-by-play announcers who have become iconic for doing just that. But NBC asked me to step into Bryant's role, and I explained to them I have almost no studio experience. In fact, the first few years that I did it, I just used note cards. I'd never looked at a teleprompter before, so I ad-libbed a lot of it. And then doing pretty well on the football led to me hosting the basketball when we got the NBA, and that's the Michael Jordan era in the 90s, and then also hosting the Olympics. But had Bryant remained, those jobs rightly would have been his, and he would have been great at it.
It's incredible. I want to just remind you of some of the amazing moments in your career that you broadcast. Derek Jeter's final at-bat in Yankee Stadium, Tiger Woods winning the U.S. Open in 2008, Michael Jordan's final NBA championship, just to name a few. Was there one moment in all of your career that stands out
Well,
above
that
the rest?
2008 U.S. Open, that really belongs to Dan Hicks, who called it so masterfully. And I always thought that Dan should have won the Sports Emmy for play-by-play that year, because not only did he have Tiger Woods, but he had Michael Phelps and his 8 gold medals in the Olympics in Beijing. And whoever won it, I'm sure, was great, but Dan should have won it that year. I was just the host. A lot of times I was just kind of there. You know, I was lucky enough to be there.
You were rarely just there.
But sometimes, sometimes I was front and center, no doubt. Michael Jordan's last shot for the Bulls, he did come back and play a couple of years with the Wizards, but essentially that's the way the curtain came down on his career. And I've always felt that a really good broadcast, a sports broadcast, if it's significant enough, should be the first draft of history, that you should hit upon the themes that are likely to appear in a well-written story in Sports Illustrated a few days later. And I think I managed to do that in that moment. There was no way you could have anticipated how it would end. Utah was winning the game, and had they won that night, Game 7 would have been on their home floor, and they might have won that game, and so Jordan's career could have ended in defeat. But I was aware enough of the storylines that were possible so that when it panned out as it did, I think I was able to put the caption beneath it that was appropriate.
Did you know in that moment how significant, how historic it would be?
I had some sense of it, yes.
And how does it feel to be a part of a moment that big in history?
It's exhilarating. It's completely exhilarating. And you know, more recently, I was engaged, I was professional, but I didn't have the same feeling of exhilaration. You know, I guess that happens with the passage of time. But the first time I was involved in a Super Bowl, the first time a World Series, or through the years, you know, I'm in my 40s then when Michael Jordan did what he did. You're in the prime of your life, in the prime of your career, and you just hope that you'll be equal to the moment.
The moment we find ourselves in now with sports, because the industry is changing in a lot of ways. And I want to get your thoughts about that. You have tech giants like Amazon, Apple, and Netflix who are getting into live sports coverage. How do you think that's changing the way people watch sports, absorb sports, and enjoy these pastimes?
Well, sports is coming at people, if they want to access it, from so many different directions. It used to be, this is how ancient I am, when I was part of the NBC Game of the Week in the 80s, that really was the game of the week on television. In most markets, very few games were on TV. And if you lived in a non-big league market, if you lived in Montana, the one game you saw was that game on Saturday afternoon on NBC. And so it registered with people in a different way. Now, if you want to, you can access every game. There are highlights everywhere, including on the internet. So information and enjoyment in one way or another are coming at people from so many different directions that even network television, which is still at the center of it, but it doesn't own it. It doesn't have the complete primacy that it once had. So someone like me, I guess I was lucky to land where I did. It was the modern era, yes, but it still had many vestiges of the classic era that had preceded it. And the games that I was involved in, including the Olympics, I think just landed differently than some things may today.
Do you think the fact that everything, every sport, every game is accessible, does that take away some of the excitement?
I think it does diminish it to some extent. There are also different aspects to it as well. Gambling, so much of it is, for at least some portion of the audience, transactional now. You got to bet on the game. You have a different relationship to how that game plays out than if you're just rooting for your team. And then also there's the internet, where there are no misdemeanors, only felony. So you lose a game and the coach should be fired, or the guy who went 0 for 4 should be traded. There's kind of a harder edge to it than there used to be. And a lot of sports coverage that's not event coverage now is a bunch of people yelling at each other for an hour over a half dozen different sports stories. And it's all sound bites and arguments and clickbait stuff. And a lot of the journalism, which used to be part of sports, has been diminished. HBO Sports, which was the gold standard in that regard, is gone now, including Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel. ESPN does fewer outside the lines and 30 for 30s than they used to. The relationship has always been an interesting one between sports and the outlets that carry them, because you're simultaneously covering them, but you're also partners with them. You pay a rights fee. And so it's difficult sometimes to take a clear-eyed, critical view within that context. I tried to do it judiciously as much as I could, but the relationship between networks and sports leagues is the only one I can think of where the buyer has to continually flatter the seller. Now, most of the time, I'm good with that, because I saw my role as a textured role. Yes, you're a dramatist. Yes, you're a reporter and maybe occasionally a journalist, but it's your job to emphasize the drama and the excitement and the shared experience. But there are also issues in sports which, generally speaking, television is less likely to delve into than print journalism is.
You bring up sports betting, and I do want to ask you about that, because it's generating billions of dollars in revenue. But we are also seeing, in some cases, people's savings depleted.
Yes.
Some people going into debt. Do you think sports betting should be more regulated now that it has been legalized?
I'm not expert enough to know exactly what the legislation would look like, but perhaps there should be more regulation. We're moving toward nearly all 50 states legalizing gambling at this point. And it's inevitable if, in fact, as a group and over time, gamblers didn't lose more than they win, then no back alley crap game, no casino in Atlantic City or Vegas, no racetrack, and now BetMGM, DraftKings, whatever it is, would ever exist. In the big picture, the house always wins. And some people, especially now because it's so easy, my dad had to find a bookie who was in most cases probably connected to the mob. And surreptitiously he had to place his bets. Now you've got young guys with the phone in their hand. It's right there. And some of those people are going to become addicted to it, and it's going to ruin some lives. That's inevitable.
Given your father, your background, your childhood, you've witnessed this up close and personal.
Yes.
Is this personal for you? Are you concerned on a personal level about what sports betting might mean for some families?
I am, and on both the Major League Baseball Network and when I did a handful of games on Turner, I refused to read the gambling promos. They had to have someone else read them or use a voice of God type person to read them. I just couldn't in good conscience encourage people to do something which I know For some of them, it's obviously just a little recreation and it's fine. But there's an insidious aspect to it that I didn't want to be part of.
Well, you talk about the fact that baseball is in many ways your first love.
Yeah.
And we are seeing technological changes with baseball, the pitch clock. Do you think that these changes are good? Are they bringing in younger viewers?
Yeah, I think they were necessary. I was pushing for it for years before it finally came to fruition. I've put it this way for a long time. Baseball is supposed to have a pleasing, leisurely pace. It's not supposed to have a plodding, lethargic pace, which it had for too long in recent memory. A 3-2 game is not supposed to take 3.5 hours. Now that 3-2 game, same outcomes within it, takes maybe 45 minutes less than that. And that pace, the players adjusted to it quickly, and I think fans appreciate it. It's easier to stick with a game when you know it's not going to last forever, when it has an appropriate pace to it. What I don't like, though, is I don't like the runner on second base automatically in the 10th inning. That's not baseball. They should play at least one inning straight. And if you want to put someone on second base, the ghost runner or whatever you want to call it, starting in the 11th inning, go ahead. And I realize why they want to do it, even though people talk forever about marathon games. Oh, I was at a game that went 19 innings, went 21 innings. In modern baseball, the managers don't want that to happen because it blows out their pitching staff. No one pitches a complete game anymore. So if a game goes 19 innings, you're using your entire pitching staff. So that's the reason why they want to get them over more quickly. But I think they could play at least one inning straight.
Okay, well, let me ask you about your other love, what we've been talking about, the Olympics. The United States is set to host the Summer Olympics in 2028. What makes for, in your opinion, a successful Olympics when it comes to the broadcasters? What are you going to be watching for?
Well, compelling stories, and every Olympics has them. If it's a domestic Olympics, and I was lucky enough to do one in Atlanta in '96, and then a Winter Olympics in 2002 in Salt Lake, if there are American storylines that are legitimate, I never like to just invent them or overhype them, but if there are legitimate American storylines, then that drives ratings and drives interest as well. There are always stories at the Olympics, and I think Roone Arledge set the template, and Dick Ebersol picked up on it, and now his successors at NBC have followed this game plan, and it's the right one. At the Olympics, the viewer is not as familiar with it in the intervening years. You know, at the Super Bowl, it's just the NFL writ large. The World Series is baseball writ large. But not many people in the United States are following most Olympic sports except during those 2 weeks. And you have to familiarize them with who the competitors are, including the non-American competitors. What's their backstory? What makes them interesting? What's their journey been like? And then you can decide whether you like them or not, and whether you're going to root for them or against them.
That's a really good point, that in some ways you're filling in the blanks for the country on who they should be rooting for and why.
You get to the Super Bowl, they've already decided whether they're rooting for or against Peyton Manning or Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes or whatever.
Yeah, well, I had the wonderful opportunity to sit down and speak with the most decorated Olympian, Michael Phelps. And he spoke very candidly about his battle with mental health. And one of the things that he said was he thinks that the Olympic Committee should do more to support its athletes, to give them mental health support. Do you agree with that statement? And do you think it extends to all sports?
Yes, and there are sports psychologists. For the most part, they're concerned with maximizing performance. But if you broaden that out, you can also talk about the mental health challenges that a certain percentage of us face. There should be no shame in that. I give Michael Phelps a lot of credit for being front and center about that and what he had to overcome, and still perhaps to some extent has to be aware of. Yeah, I think this is a legitimate issue. Michael talked with me about it, I think in 2016, before his last Olympics. or was it 2012? I'm losing track. At this point, it all runs together. At some point, Michael Phelps talked to me about it, and I give him credit for being as candid as he has been.
And within that context, and based on your conversation with Michael Phelps, what would your message be to the Olympic Committee and frankly, to other sports outlets? What should they know about what athletes need to remain healthy?
Well, you have multiple levels. You have the individual federations, and then you have the National Olympic Committees, and then you have the IOC, which encompasses the whole thing. So what happens within swimming or what happens within gymnastics is distinct from what happens within track and field. But in theory, any of those people could have issues. I mean, think about Simone Biles as recently as, now I'm trying to rewind the clock here, I guess it was 2021 because they had to put it off because of COVID in Japan. And she had some issues with what they call the twisties being up in the air, and she had to bow out. And some people praised her for that, for her candor and being upfront about it. And others criticized her for it. Hey, an athlete's supposed to be tough. You're supposed to persevere through it. So that alone, the differing reactions to that alone, shows you that this is still an ongoing issue.
Yeah. I want to talk to you a little bit about where we are broadly as a country. I'll give you another statistic about yourself. This is your 13th appearance on Meet the Press.
It is?
Yes.
Wow.
We looked, we checked.
Lucky 13.
Lucky 13. And it comes at a time when our country is very divided. I don't have to tell you that. Sports is unifying. People rally around their team, the games that they love. What can sports teach us and teach this country about unifying?
Well, the best of sports, especially team sports, is the idea that people from diverse backgrounds come together in the service of a common cause. That cause being to do as well as you possibly can as a team. And you look at the arena and you look at the stadium and you see people with differing political viewpoints and from differing demographics, but they're all there rooting for their team. And in that moment, that's unifying. Just look at the ratings, and it's especially true with football. We now have a fractionalized media universe. Shows that now qualify as hits get a tiny fraction of the rating that Seinfeld got or Friends or ER got in the 90s because there's so many different options. But big sports events pull together a very large audience, and that audience comes from across the demographic spectrum. So that in and of itself is unifying. On the other hand, some of the tone now that surrounds sports, as we talked about before, is angry and accusatory. And it becomes tribal sometimes in a way that isn't really all that healthy in my mind. But maybe the world has just passed me by.
Well, and politics is a part of sports.
Yes.
Sports is a part of politics. Does it concern you that we are seeing, in some instances, politics infused in sports?
I think that politics inevitably has intersected with sports. Anyone who says that politics has no place in sports has to be abysmally unaware of the history here, a history that goes all the way back to Jack Johnson and Jesse Owens and Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson and Billie Jean King and Arthur Ashe and Curt Flood and Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Now, of the names I've mentioned, with the exception of Billie Jean, most of them are African American. But that's part of the story because until fairly recently in our nation's history, sports and some aspects of entertainment have been the only avenues that were broadly, and even then there was a fight. Jackie Robinson didn't come until 1947, that were broadly accessible to people of color, or where someone like Billie Jean King could make a larger statement about women's rights, not just within sports. And to turn your back on that is to wear a blindfold. So when people say stick to sports, I think what they actually mean most often is stick to sports unless you're saying something that I want to hear and I agree with. But if you're saying something I disagree with that comes from a different perspective, well, then you should just shut up and say there's a ground ball to shortstop. I never bent to that.
Well, and in fact, in a few specific moments in your own career, you decided to come off the sidelines and to weigh into some divisive issues, from gun control. You've spoken out about other issues that have gotten attention. How did you decide which moments you were going to come off of the sidelines and weigh in on issues that could be divisive?
Well, the gun thing was and still is widely misunderstood. It was about a gun culture in the country and in sports. And all you have to do is Google athletes with guns to see the long list of criminality, folly, and tragedy attached to that. And saying that that's an issue is not the same thing as saying, let's throw out the Second Amendment. So that was widely misunderstood. The Washington then Redskins team name was an issue that NBC asked me to talk about because Washington was playing Dallas on Sunday Night Football only days after President Obama had talked about it. There were some protests from the Oneida Nation. Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner, said, we'll have to take a look at it. So they asked me to comment on it. And that's knocking around on YouTube. It's 2 minutes. And I think I did a very nuanced job of saying, look, no one's accusing the Washington team, its players, or its fans of being racist or that that is their intention. But let's make a distinction here. Every dictionary defines Redskins as pejorative, derogatory, an insult, a slur. There are no such definitions attached to Braves, Chiefs, Warriors, names that might be associated with Native Americans, but are only objectionable if the symbols or rituals are objectionable. That's a distinction. In this world, people often don't want to make distinctions. Everything's binary. Right? If you don't like Trump, that means you must be embracing everything the Democrats are doing. And if you don't like some of what the Democrats are doing, that must mean that you're a MAGA person. And there are millions and millions of Americans who are in between those two extremes and who recognize distinctions and nuance. And I hope I'm one of them.
Do you have any regrets about anything, about in any way dipping your toe into the topics that you just discussed?
The one I have regret about is the gun thing, because I took for granted that what I was saying, and I was actually quoting Jason Whitlock, ironically now a hero to the right wing, but a writer then in Kansas City who had played football himself, and it was coming off of a tragic incident involving Jovan Belcher, who played for the Kansas City Chiefs and murdered his fiancée and then killed himself on the same day in a murder-suicide. I quoted from what he had written, and I thought it was self-evident that people would see that what I was saying and what he was saying was, we have entered an area where the gun is too often the first resort, not as a matter of self-defense. I thought that was self-evident. I was wrong. And in retrospect, I wish that I had made the same point I wanted to make, but that I had made it in a better way. I'm generally pretty precise, and that time I wasn't as precise as I should have been. But that doesn't mean that those who knowingly misrepresented what I said, not just in the aftermath, but to this day, that doesn't get them off the hook. You know, when people have a straw man, they don't want to give up the straw man. If you clarify it, you say, oh, okay, now I get it.
Well, it speaks to how divided our country is. Do you think sports can still be a unifying force? I mean, to your point, every one of the top 10 highest rated TV events in 2024 were sports.
Well, sure, it can be a unifying force. Everybody watches the Super Bowl, you watch the World Series, the NBA Finals, whatever it might be, and the next day people are talking about it, and there's generally no reason for politics to enter into it. It should be about, hey, should they have taken this guy out and put that guy in? Would you have done this in this situation? What do you think about this guy being traded? That's what it should be about. But there are times when it crosses over. You know, if your city is being asked to devote public funds to subsidizing the building of a new stadium or arena, which is owned by billionaires, when there are other needs within your community, that is a subject of debate from a political standpoint. It happens to be about sports, but I don't see how you ignore that. Now, you can ignore that during the game. Very, very, very seldom during a game itself have I ever alluded to any of those things. When I hosted the Olympics, if there was interstitial programming, and there's plenty of it during the Olympics, and I was asked to interview the president of the IOC, then some of those questions, anyone who thinks the Olympics isn't loaded with political overtones isn't paying any attention, historically and at present. So that's when I would make those points or ask those questions, but not when Michael Phelps was jumping in the pool or Usain Bolt was about to bolt out of the blocks. That, when people say, I'm just trying to watch the game. Hey, Jack, the game, it's halftime. Or this is a moment in between. This is not when the event is going on. I hope I'm not going too fast for you here.
Well, one of the things that makes sports so unique right now is social media, as it has changed the shape of just about everything that we do. And you see athletes communicating with their fans directly. How does that change the shape of sports broadcasting? Or does it?
I think those of us who've mostly worked in network television have been fortunate and remain fortunate because we get a certain kind of access, because the game is on national TV. But it has changed the way athletes react to the guy on the beat. It's harder for the guy or woman on the beat to get closer to those they cover, because that social media aspect, their Instagram or whatever it is, their X account, is the way they speak unfiltered to their audience. And they're all making a lot of money, and they have all kinds of hangers-on in many cases and advisors who are telling them, why take the risk of being interviewed by this man or this woman when you could stub your toe? Now, that doesn't mean that everybody follows that path, but I think more people than previously follow that path. And social media, as we've talked about before, can be an awful place. It's a place where truth and fairness are optional, and where everything has to be at high decibels. Everything has to be clickbait. No misdemeanors, only felonies. Just the other day, I happened across this. Someone was interviewing me about Michael Jordan's last game with the Bulls, which we have talked about. And I said, I once crossed paths with Michael, and I kidded him. I said, you messed up my place in the time capsule by coming back and playing with the Wizards. That should have been your last thing. Clearly a joke. The way the headline of this thing was on some site, Bob Costas, still livid with Michael Jordan, lambasts him for coming back to the Wizards. What? It's a harmless little joke. And the person who did that knows that. One of two things are true. Either the person's a complete idiot, or he or she knows that, but they do it for clicks. And I think one of the things that is most important now for young people, and I think this could begin at the latter stages of grade school and should continue through college, is media literacy. Not teaching anyone or instructing anyone what to think, but how to determine what is credible as you go about deciding yourself what your opinion is or what your point of view is. Here's a conservative outlet that is credible. Here's a bunch that are not. Here's something over here that's credible and a bunch over here that are not.
Speaking of young people, if you could speak to a teenager who tries out for that sports team that they so desperately want to join, and they stumble, they make a mistake, what advice do you give that person about how not to lose confidence in what their life goals might be?
I can only imagine, not having grown up with it myself, and my own children are in their 30s, and I think they predate the real torrent of this stuff that has occurred more recently. The effects of social media. You hear about the depression and the low self-esteem that sometimes comes from being mocked on social media at a time, adolescence, when people are particularly vulnerable, when their sense of themselves hasn't been fully developed. And now if we're talking about sports, where you could drop the pass that loses the game or miss the shot that loses the game, and if you're being mocked or taken harshly to task by people who either don't have the common decency or the intelligence to realize you're talking about kids here.
Yeah.
You're not talking about a guy making $30 million a year who you might hold to greater account. You're talking about kids here. So I guess that's just one more way, as fun and as beneficial as participating in sports can be, it's obviously just one more area where potentially people can be cruel to you. And part of media literacy is learning what not to pay any attention to, either about yourself or about the world.
And just finally, as you think about the future, do you ever miss it? Do you ever think about getting back into the game?
I don't miss what I used to do. I think I can still be effective and still enjoy it in an emeritus role. So whatever I do should be in an emeritus role. But I have had more than enough times at bat, to throw out a cliched type metaphor. I've had more than enough times at bat. And many years ago, I passed the baton. I passed the baton to Mike Tirico on the Olympics, and he's done a wonderful job for NBC. And I've always felt that there's so many different ways to be good. Mike is good in a way that's different than I hope I was good in my own way. And I'm generally satisfied and gratified with what my career has been.
Bob Costas, anything I missed?
There's always something more. I think we covered enough.
Thank you.
Good luck editing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.